In the shadow of the fallen Messer regime, the UAE Navy found itself in a precarious position. Their aging capital ship fleet was crumbling, just as the Vandal threat began to resurge with renewed ferocity. Aegis Dynamics, once the crown jewel of military production, had fallen from grace, leaving a dangerous void in naval superiority that the emerging alien menace was all too eager to exploit. The military brass, desperate and running out of options, turned to an unlikely savior, Roberts Space Industries, a corporation whose reputation was built on civilian vessels and scientific exploration rather than the art of space warfare. What followed would reshape the course of human history among the stars as RSI dusted off long, dormant military blueprints and repurposed their massive shipyards for war. The Bengal carrier wasn't just another ship. It represented humanity's defiant answer to extinction, a self-sustaining design that could project power across vast distances of deep space missions. As antimatter reactors were installed and heavy armor plates were methodically layered onto the massive hull, even the most skeptical admirals in the UAE Navy watched with growing hope. Perhaps this commercial giant could deliver what military contractors had failed to provide, a legitimate chance at survival. The massive shipyards hanging in Earth's Lagrange points had never seen such feverish activity, as RSI engineers worked around the clock to transform commercial production lines into military-grade facilities. The UAE Navy, watching the Vandal threat expand with each passing day, had little choice but to embrace RSI's bold proposition to develop the next generation of capital ships. What began as a desperate gamble soon evolved into a renaissance of human space warfare technology, with RSI leveraging their expertise in civilian ship design to create military vessels that outmatched enemy combat strategy through innovation rather than brute force. While the public saw only the impressive silhouette of the Bengal carrier taking shape against the starry backdrop, behind the scenes, a revolution in fleet modernization was unfolding. Aegis Dynamics executives watched in barely concealed fury as their former military contracts were redirected to their commercial rival. But RSI wasn't merely building ships. They were redefining human naval superiority with vessels designed not just to win battles, but to survive prolonged campaigns. The Bengal's massive frame housed not just weapons, but an entire ecosystem of military production capabilities, ensuring that even deep in hostile territory, the carrier could maintain its squadron deployment capabilities indefinitely. You haven't seen true power until you've witnessed a Bengal carrier unleash its full arsenal in the void of space. Trust me, even veteran combat pilots go silent when those ship-buster railguns light up the darkness. The UAE Navy commanders don't just talk about firepower with these monsters. They measure destructive capability in terms of how many enemy capital ships can be cored in a single engagement. 20 twin-linked size 7 ballistic cannons might sound impressive on paper, but watching them work in concert with the Phalanx defense systems creates a symphony of destruction that would make even the most battle-hardened Vandal think twice about their next move. What makes the Bengal truly terrifying isn't just its offensive capabilities. It's the calculated redundancy engineered into every system. When RSI designed this battle-ready Leviathan, they didn't just create another capital ship. They built a mobile fortress capable of sustaining space warfare long after conventional vessels would have retreated for repairs. The antimatter reactor hidden deep within layers of heavy armor ensures that power is never a concern, even when pushing those massive railguns to their limits. I've seen footage of a Bengal taking direct hits that would vaporize smaller military production vessels, only to respond with doubled ferocity, because in deep space, there are no second chances, only survivors and the forgotten. The Bengal's hull isn't just armored. It's a masterclass in warship resilience engineering that makes ancient Earth's most legendary battleships look like fragile toys by comparison. 92 centimeters of specialized heavy armor encase the carrier's vital systems, creating a protective shell that would have made even the mighty Yamato's designers weep with envy. But the true genius lies in the sloped hull design, a feature that Aegis Dynamics military contracts never quite perfected, allowing the Bengal to deflect rather than absorb the kinetic energy of incoming projectiles. The Vandal learned this lesson the hard way when their typical melee combat tactics were met with an unmovable object that refused to crumble. What few outside the UAE Navy understand is that a Bengal carrier's armor isn't merely passive protection, it's an active component of combat strategy. The strategically reinforced sections create intentional strong points that can be presented to enemy fire, protecting the more vulnerable systems and allowing the massive capital ship to dictate the terms of engagement. I've watched classified footage of a Bengal deliberately rotating to catch incoming fire on its thickest plates, all while positioning its ship-buster railguns for a killing blow. In the brutal calculus of space warfare, a vessel that can choose when and where to take damage isn't just surviving, it's controlling the very flow of battle. What separates the Bengal from other capital ships isn't just its imposing silhouette or devastating firepower. It's the revolutionary self-sustaining design that allows it to vanish into the black for decades at a time. The antimatter reactor, humming at the core of this behemoth, doesn't just power the weapons systems. It fuels an entire floating city dedicated to naval superiority, complete with manufacturing facilities that can produce replacement parts for both the carrier and its squadron deployment of fighters. I've heard stories from UEE Navy veterans about Bengals that ventured on deep space missions so prolonged that crew members who boarded as ensigns returned as captains, with children born aboard who had never seen the surface of a planet. The internal geography of a Bengal is a marvel of human ingenuity, with over 1,000 crew members navigating its cavernous halls via an internal tram system that connects engineering to the bridge as efficiently as any planetary metro. Each of the 476 designated crew stations has been meticulously designed for maximum efficiency, a necessity when coordinating the myriad systems that keep this massive warship functioning at peak capacity. But the true miracle is the psychological design, subtle features incorporated throughout to prevent the madness that long-term isolation can bring, ensuring that when this beast of military production finally returns to friendly space, its crew remains as sharp and deadly as the day they departed. Since rolling out of RSI's Earth shipyards in 2871, the Bengal carrier hasn't just served the UEE Navy. It's become the very embodiment of humanity's dominance among the stars. That distinctive silhouette, recognizable even from extreme distances, strikes fear in enemy hearts and ignites fierce pride in human ones. There's a reason military recruitment numbers spike dramatically whenever a Bengal makes a public appearance during fleet modernization events. The continuous production of these capital ships at facilities orbiting Earth and Killian represents not just military strategy, but a psychological statement to both citizens and enemies alike. The UEE's naval superiority is not temporary, but an established fact of cosmic politics that will endure for generations. I was lucky enough to witness the UES Krugeri in action once, Captain Wade's 65th Battle Group flagship, moving with a grace that belied its massive bulk, a testament to RSI's engineering prowess. The classified number of Bengals in service keeps enemy strategists awake at night, but everyone's seen footage of the UES Barbary anchoring Stanton's defense force during Invictus celebrations, its heavy armor gleaming in the sunlight as squadron. Deployment drills demonstrate the seamless coordination between carrier and fighters. What most civilians don't realize is that each Bengal represents not just a triumph of military production, but the culmination of countless technological breakthroughs in space warfare that eventually filter down to improve everyday life across human space. There's something profoundly fitting about the feline naming tradition of the Bengal-class carriers. These ships prowl the stars with the same lethal grace as their ancient Earth namesakes once stalked the jungles. The UEE Navy didn't choose these names by accident. Every vessel in this legendary class embodies the predatory qualities that have made the Bengal carrier the apex hunter of space warfare. The UES Krugeri, named for a South African lion renowned for its resilience, carries that indomitable spirit into every engagement, while the UES Barbary honors an extinct North African lion, a poignant reminder that even the mightiest can fall without proper protection, a lesson the military contracts specialists at RSI took to heart when designing these warship resilience systems. When a Bengal carrier emerges from the void, its massive silhouette backlit by distant stars, it doesn't just represent UEE naval superiority. It stands as a living monument to humanity's refusal to become extinct. Each vessel serves as both sword and shield, their heavy armor and ship-buster railguns ensuring that human civilization can weather any storm the cosmos might unleash. The classified specs that detail the true capabilities of these deep space missions, capable Leviathans, remain one of the UE's most closely guarded secrets, yet the confidence they inspire is universal. As one veteran captain told me after decades, commanding a Bengal. We don't just fight in these ships, we carry the very future of our species within their hulls. Within the sprawling universe of Star Citizen, no vessel captures the imagination quite like the elusive Bengal carrier, the ultimate symbol of power projection that players glimpse more often in legends than in actual gameplay. While the UEE Navy jealously guards these capital ships as the crown jewels of their fleet, persistent rumors swirl through space stations and landing zones that a derelict Bengal, abandoned after some ancient battle, waits in the void for a dedicated group of players to restore it to its former glory. The sheer crew capacity requirements make player ownership a logistical nightmare. Yet, the allure of commanding such a vessel, with its legendary squadron deployment capabilities and devastating ship-buster railguns, keeps the dream alive in countless organizations. The appearance of a Bengal during Invictus Fleet Week sends ripples of excitement through the entire Star Citizen community, as players flock to witness the majestic capital ship in all its glory, imagining what gameplay possibilities might unfold if they could somehow claim such a prize. The realistic simulation of military production and naval superiority that defines the game ensures that Bengals remain appropriately rare and significant. After all, in a universe where consequences matter, the presence of a vessel with such overwhelming combat strategy advantages would forever alter the balance of power. For now, most players must be content with serving aboard NPC-controlled Bengals during special missions, gaining a tantalizing glimpse of the warship resilience and firepower that makes these vessels the unchallenged masters of deep space. Was your mind blown by the sheer destructive potential of the RSI Bengal carrier? Just wait until you see what's coming up next on your screen. The classified details of the Vanduul kingship that dared to challenge UEE naval superiority and learned a devastating lesson about human space warfare technology. Have you ever wondered what really happens when these two capital ships face off in deep space? Far from the sanitized battle reports the military feeds to civilians, the combat footage we've uncovered will make the Bengal's ship-buster railguns look like training weapons by comparison. What would you risk to get behind the controls of your own warship with that kind of heavy armor and antimatter reactor power? Drop your answer in the comments below and tell us which feature of the Bengal carrier impressed you most. Was it the self-sustaining design, the squadron deployment capabilities, or those devastating military production facilities hidden within its massive hull? Don't miss our upcoming exclusive on the classified next-generation UEE Navy vessels currently in development at RSI's secretive Killian shipyards. Hit subscribe right now and smash that notification bell to be the first to learn secrets that could get us all thrown into a deep space prison. The stars are calling, explorer. Will you answer?